All right. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm going to go ahead and invite the other ladies to come up on stage with me and find a seat. Welcome to Champions of Change, Women Driving Innovation and Progression in Sports. Let's hear it for these heroes. X Games has been a waymaker in women's inclusion in action sports. They were the first to initialize equal purse pay at a title event, and in the last 5 months, they've added 5 women's disciplines to medal competition. I think that's something worth celebrating, right? So let's go ahead and start by introducing our panelists. We'll start with Thayer Lavielle. Thayer is the Executive Vice President of Wasserman, the Collective. She leads a division that aims to raise the visibility of women in sports and the entertainment marketplace. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Hannah Roberts. Hannah Roberts is a 5-time world champion in women's BMX. She will be contesting this weekend as well for the first time in the women's BMX park discipline. I'm so excited, and I had a pleasure of speaking with her yesterday, and this is just an incredible woman here. We also have Cherie Cohen. Cherie is the Chief Revenue Officer at the World Surf League, which has led by example as a driving force in women's visibility in action sports. So excited to have you here with us.
Thank you.
And Miss Vicki Golden. Vicki is a trailblazer in women's motocross and women's freestyle, the first woman to medal in X Games Best Whip, or even qualify for Supercross nonetheless. Vicki Golden, thank you so much for joining us here today. She will also be on the TV team with me this weekend, so a really great crew up here with us. So I'm going to go ahead and start the questions off. Thayer, I had a lovely conversation with you earlier, and in your role with Wasserman and the Collective, in what ways are you seeing female athletes driving innovation and progression in both mainstream and action sports? I know it's a loaded question.
Well, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. So at Wasserman, the Collective kind of sits between 2 big areas of our business. So one is talent, where we represent lots of amazing athletes, artists, entertainers. And the other side is what is largely our consultative or consulting group, which is everything from strategy, research and insights, how do you put partnerships together with brands and properties? How do you value those, negotiate those, activate those, put media together for those, measure the benefit of those? And so the Collective sits kind of in the center of that, looking at everything through the lens of gender. So how do I work with talent is really about how do we actually take all of the best practices that our agents are out there pressing for women. So we have agents that are thinking about how do we put together maternity clauses and the best inclusion riders and prenups and things that really are in the best interest of women? And then how do we teach and train our agents? And then the other side of our business is really around how do you take all of this great consulting thinking and just put together the lens of women through that. So how do you value women differently? How do you look at the ecosystem differently? And so when I think about how, what we're adding is really just every which way we could provide business rationale for businesses to invest in women, full stop, whether that's athletes, whether that's entities, whether that's properties, whether that's media companies. So that's essentially why we exist. The innovation that we see is in everything from certain women who are leading the charge and out there just pressing forward to executives who are really pressing and saying we need to have equal pay, we need to have more inclusion riders, we need to think differently, men and women, we have incredible allies. So innovation for me isn't just within the talent side, it's actually, in many ways it requires a fearlessness because you are the person that's out there in front and you are the one that's on camera. But what I was talking about earlier with you, which I think you guys would agree with, the women's sports space is very collaborative. We're like a big family of people who just want to band together to push forward because we have so far to go. We just have so much more to do. And we need, by the way, guys, all the men in here, we need as much help as we can get. So come on, give a sister a hand.
Thank you so much, Thayer. Cherie, WSL, I've been following it for the longest time. obviously. We talked earlier.
You?
How great has it been to see women of the WSL really owning the spotlight there? You guys, I mean, the first thing I see when I even go to the WSL website to check rankings, you see men and women on the front page, side by side. How great has it been to see that kind of progress in your sport?
I think it's been truly amazing. I want to first start by saying I'm super excited to be here. I once sold the X Games through ESPN back in 2003, so I've got a big heart for action sports, and I've seen women like you all compete for decades, and I love to see that the spotlight is happening now, but it's been a lot of years of work. So I think that for us at the World Surf League, it started with equal pay. I like to tell people,
Woo!
right?
Some of us really like that.
Very, very important milestone. And I like to tell people we pay our athletes and our office equally. I'm an example of that. And I think that has to flow through the entire organization. And I think that then transcended into equal locations and an integrated tour where athletes were actually surfing the same conditions. You know this as a surfer.
True.
There were a lot of years where there were certain waves that were off limits to women because they were deemed too dangerous and they couldn't get time in the lineup. And so when we open the lineup to women, we see that they take the progression to the next level. So I think it's about opportunity.
And if you guys don't know the backstory on that, Google it. It's incredibly inspiring. Somebody in here, one of the creatives, needs to do a documentary on that day. And Jesse's quote particularly would be great for that. But
For sure. And so we went to a fully integrated tour, and then we assigned a woman as our commissioner. The only woman in global sport running a men and women's league, right? So that was a big move. And then it comes down to equal coverage. So we start to cover the competitions equally and give the same amount of exposure. And when you put those things together, equal pay, integrated tour system, leadership that has, female representation, and then obviously coverage, you see what happens.
Magic happens.
Turns out women like to perform, and turns out they actually like to compete at the highest level, and they can do it.
And have recently been stealing the show if you've been following the circuit at all. Congratulations. Thank you so much, Cherie. Question for our athletes on the stage, for Hannah and Vicki. Hannah, if you want to go ahead and answer first. What challenges have you personally faced in your goal to push women's BMX forward? Let's get real.
That's a great question. First of all, thank you for having me. X Games was the reason I started riding. I seen it on TV at 8 and I fell in love with it. So to be here is and a dream come true, honestly. But for, my career, there's been a lot of just bumps in the road. And when I first started riding and competing professionally on the world circuit, like money was a huge thing, exposure was a huge thing. We had no live stream. Nobody could watch our events. I think my first event I made $250. And the men's, I couldn't even tell you what they made, but they made bank. But now, pushing really, really hard. The women's side progression-wise in our sport has been just astronomical in the last, 3 or 4 years. To the point where it's almost unrecognizable from 2019. It's been just absolutely insane. And to try to, continue to push, you have to strive so hard. And there's so many women out there that want to be at the top. So it's super, super cool. For us as a group of riders, just like to continuously push each other. Excuse me. But to continuously push each other is crazy. But, we still have the same thing of, with live streams, we finally got live streams maybe 2 years ago. We just got equal pay 2 years ago. And there's still like things, like TV time. We're always at like 5 in the morning, like for everybody else back home. Our practice usually starts at 8 and we have like the worst wind and rain conditions, and that's still stuff that we're working through. And it's a long time coming, but we're starting to see the care about women's sport, BMX freestyle side, a lot more recently. So that's really exciting for us.
Vicki, your story is so unique in that you spent a great deal of your career coming up racing in women's motocross, but then you reached a point where you had tapped out there and you started competing against men. You had to create your own lane, break a lot of glass ceilings for us women. What obstacles have you faced in trying to grow women's involvement in motocross?
Thank you, Kristen. And yeah, it's obviously a different path compared to Hannah. I think the BMX community has amazingly grown in such a short and awesome amount of time. But unfortunately, Moto just hasn't taken that path quite yet. Like you mentioned, I raced women's professional series for a few years, and I was lucky enough to be at the age where I was turning pro at the peak of that series, where we were racing the same day as the men's professional outdoor. We were getting TV coverage. We were getting decent pay. A few women were actually getting factory rides on factory teams alongside and underneath the same tent, getting equipment that you can't buy. It was very much at the peak. I was actually lucky enough to fill in for a rider named Cherie Cohen under a factory Honda tent. So we were definitely at the prime of things. Unfortunately, that was about the last year. As I reached it, started to decrease quite aggressively, unfortunately. At that same time, it was just kind of coming down to me not really having any fun. And when you're in that position of not making money and you're realizing that it's not as fun as you'd hoped it to be, and the racing's not as intense, and you're not getting that fix you're searching for, that's kind of when I started to take that different career path of going up against the guys and racing arena cross and heading on to supercross, just because just my friends. My friends were all males in the sport, and they were riding.
And they supported you. They created a community that made you feel welcome, but still it's hard.
Exactly. I mean, I remember my first day on a full-blown supercross track, and I had I think it was a full-blown supercross racer at the time, Darren Durham. He towed me over a couple of the jumps I was a bit nervous about, and he's a full factory rider and just wanted to help.
Yeah.
And since that day, it was just moving forward to try, and I just fell in love with the art of supercross because it was so different than racing outside. Outside for motocross, you're just wide open, the tracks are really rough, and it's just high speed and high intensity, to where when you go inside for racing supercross, it is a lot more technique. You have zero room for error. So I just really thrived at the idea of different combinations and different ideas of ways to get through the course. And so once I fell in love with that, that's when I really thrived to go and join arena cross and try and earn my men's professional license, instead of trying to get a pass for one, per se. I think that was like a option, and I basically said, no, I want to earn it. So I went and raced arena cross for a few years. I ended up getting a very cool support and opportunity to race for another well-rounded team for arena cross, which was amazing. The best team in arena cross wanted to help me, which was amazing at that point, because financially things were very difficult. So being able to race arena cross, get my men's professional license, and then go into supercross, which is the highest of high of our sport, is supercross. So you can't get any higher. And I wanted to go race that. I raced that for a few years and ended up getting Epstein-Barr and not being able to train at the way I wanted to. So once I decided that I couldn't do it at the highest level the way that I knew how, that's kind of when I started transitioning into freestyle, free ride. And along that path, we had X Games creating the peak for women's sports as well. So once I transitioned into that arena cross, that was the same style of what we had here at X Games for women's Moto X. So it just
X Games opened the door with women's Moto X
exactly.
and put women's competition back on the main stage. So.
Exactly. We were hunting and herding for a few years there, and that's when I like I said, the style that X Games created for us to be racing was very similar to going to race in men's arena cross. So it actually elevated my game to where that's where I came on. I think my first year, I had zero experience in the style that they created for us, and I think I placed 4th in the women's Moto X category. I continued on in arena cross and came back to win because of that transition into basically getting bullied by the boys and coming here and being able to race women's Moto X. It was an amazing transition, and then being able to come and get a women's Moto X gold medal, that elevated things even more and brought so much attention to the sport as well.
You still inspire me today. I don't know how you made it through that journey. Like, there are times that I'm like, this is really hard, but when you hear something like that and all of the obstacles you've had to overcome, just, it's incredible.
Well, you inspire me because you're my favorite commentator of all time. So
Look at that. A lot of, like what we talked about earlier, the female community.
Fangirling.
We have a great community here. Thayer, what effective strategies have you utilized to promote the exposure and growth in women's sports?
So we look at the entire ecosystem as, and action, I would say, as a whole is a little bit different than traditional stick and ball in that because action sports are often regarded as more niche sports individually, there seems to be, and tell me if you guys feel differently, a sense of we're all in this together. And so to be able to have respect for the other gender who's competing against you is a much more normalized thing here. The way that we try to affect change is essentially a couple things. One is we really believe that you can't go out and create change without actually knowing what the issues are. And so to say like, well, it's just not equal. It's just, we just need equal pay, or well, if you're a woman in the sports industry, whether you're an athlete or you're an executive, it's broken at every spoke. We need more exposure. We need to be on the same, we need to have the same visibility. We need to be able to have the same equipment, the ability to be able to travel the same, the ability to be able to have, the same options of, I don't know, whatever the men get, basically. So every kind of stop along the way, it's broken. And so how do we identify what those are, and how do we start to solve for those? So we spend a lot of time looking at research. We deep dive into everything from who is she as a consumer, who is she as a fan, what does she need when she comes to the X Games? By the way, we also give birth to humans. So like we do have different needs. And I walked in here and somebody was like, hey, I need to go pump. Like, where can I go do that? Has that been contemplated? Like, it's just, it is what it is. And so as athletes, when you're thinking about that, it's like, hey, we teach our agents very early on to say, if you're representing women, the biggest question a woman has is to baby or not to baby. And so how are you addressing that as an agent to be able to say, at what point would you like to have a baby? Would you like to freeze your eggs? What is your menstrual cycle? How does that affect your performance? Which of course many men are not comfortable with at the outset. So it's normalizing a lot of this conversation around what it means to compete as a woman. And then when we're diving into research around it, it's just helping to normalize the conversation around everything from, we've done research on the value of women athletes. We've done research on, which by the way, on the field of play, men make 21 times what women make, which means that women have to work twice as hard, basically, to make 82% of their income off the field of play. So you're all doing your day jobs, and then you have to go make 82% of your living. But because of that, they've created this relationship with their fans that is much more loyal, because it's also harder to find women's sports. It's harder to buy their merch. It's harder to understand where to get a ticket. It's harder to all these things. And so fans are really loyal, usually. Very similar, actually, to action sports. So when they finally get there, women athletes are generally driving 2 times the engagement online than their male counterparts. So when we know these things, that's something that women athletes can go take to brands and say, I'm driving double the engagement. We do coverage reports. We did a report around, for a long time, there was a stat that said less than 4% of all sports media coverage goes to women's sports. We, along with ESPN, said, maybe that's outdated. Maybe we need to look at this methodology differently now that we all have cell phones and there's linear and streaming and stuff. So we went in and looked at 1.2 billion lines of data, and it turns out it's closer to 16%. Okay, still not great, right? The kicker is that when we looked at this, it wasn't necessarily that it was the amount of coverage. Of course, we all want more coverage. It's actually that when you look at the number of competitions, now we're looking not at action sports, to be fair, but when you're looking at all Division I competitions, men's and women's, 53% of all Division I competitions are women's. 53%. When you look at professional, only 8% are women's. So what that means is it's not that they're like networks or people are saying, I don't want to cover this. It's that there's not enough to cover. We need more leagues, we need more teams, we need more things to be visible. We need more things to be out there to be able to say there is coverage to talk about now because we're seeing it online or through whatever distribution point.
Thank you so much, Thayer. Cherie, how can industry leaders support these efforts that Thayer just kind of touched on?
I think, first of all that information is really great to get out into
Amazing.
the world, right?
Yeah.
Like, so people understand the nuances between the male and female athlete. Thayer touched on something that I think is extremely important, and I talk about this a lot at the World Surf League, and I think the same exists at the X Games, is you have this opportunity for allyship. Between male and female athletes. And the allyship between the athletes, I think, is critical to the support system on a tour or at events. And when they're rooting for each other and they want each other to succeed, we see great things happen. So I think if we're creating cultures of allyship, I think that can be a really strong environment to develop more female athletes. I also look at like the opportunity of action sports in general and the generations they serve. The average athlete on our tour is 22 years old, right? And I think it's probably even a little younger around here. And we look at the generation of the kids following those athletes and how they are growing up with less restrictions, less stereotypes, less preconceived notions. And I think we need to take advantage of that and empower our fans to tell us that they want to see these young women compete and give them a voice sort of in the economy of it all, right? Make the merch available for their favorite athletes, give them the coverage. And of course, you know, as we're sitting across the desk from executives, whether it's a media company, brand, or investor, we're talking about both of our athletes and the value of the collective group. And I think that rises all tides.
Cherie, thank you so much. Thayer, prior to working at the collective, you worked with major brands directly, Pepsi, Amex. You have an understanding of how those brands market, how they see women. I think especially in this room in action sports, finding non-endemic brands to partner with can be tough. So instead of going for the skateboard sponsor, how do we get Pepsi involved in women's sports? How do those brands see women, and how do you go about acquiring sponsorship from those non-endemic brands?
Yeah, I mean, each brand is different, and I would say the cool part is right now, so many brands are interested and engaged in wanting to be in women's sports. And so that's where, again, we spend a lot of time thinking about, well, how do we convince Pepsi to get involved? It's not that they don't want to, it's that they don't know how to estimate their return, or they don't know how to value what Cherie is offering or what these amazing athletes are offering. And so we have to be able to build tools that help articulate that. For the average athlete, I think it comes down to, and you know, fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of it is just how much exposure do you have? What is the reach that you are providing for that
Having
brand?
data for them and having
Having
numbers.
data, but it's having, for an athlete, it's having social reach. It's being able to say, I am a physical and living extension of you. There has to be mutual admiration between athlete and brand, or else it will never work. There has to be an ability for the brand to be able to relinquish and say, you know what, Hannah and Vicki are the best spokespeople for us, and we're going to let them go be themselves, and vice versa, and that they're able to be playful in themselves and to be able to articulate their affinity for the brand back and to cultivate community there. In order to do that, though, there has to be a network that they're already reaching, basically. So I would say certainly social media is a big one, and certainly continuing to have a voice, an articulated voice about what you actually care about helps differentiate you from the pack.
Cherie, what feedback have you received from your partners regarding their investment into women in action sports?
I mean, so we're at an interesting life cycle within the World Surf League. I think when I started the league, about 25% of our business came from what we call endemic surf industry. And I guess fortunately for us, we've been able to transition to a place where only 4% of our business is coming from the surf industry. So we've had to go out and convince big blue chip brands to sponsor our sport first and foremost, and then of course to sponsor our women. But I think it does come down to something that you said is, finding the right brand match. I mean, I'm looking in the room and I can already see non-endemic brands that sponsor badass women. Because they fit their ethos, right? And I think it's about really getting to know your brand's objectives and their business and making the right business case, because these athletes are very talented, come with engaged networks, and can do great things for lots of different brands. And so I think it's about doing the homework. And I do hear a lot of, conversation and interest in women's sports, more so now than ever. I mean, I think we all just saw pictures from Cannes where people were talking about women's sports and giving them the main stage. I'd like to say to all of those folks, now let's put our money where our mouth is and start investing.
Do you hear that, y'all?
And I say that gently because I'll ask the boys to do the same. It comes with the territory. But I think it's up to us to try to make business sense for these brands and properties and media companies to make that investment. And I think they're getting ready to do that in a big way.
Sorry, the last thing that I'll say is, we represent a lot of amazing women athletes. Some of the best basketball players, soccer players, et cetera. The ones that really are doing the biggest deals are not always the best in their game. We have an athlete in particular who is literally the top of her game, and it's hard to get deals. And it's because she isn't as personable. She's lovely when you talk to her, but she's just not as out there as many of these other athletes. And so it truly is about brand development, more so than ever before with social media. And as a somewhat old person, that's exhausting to think about. And I'm glad it's a game for somebody else. But it's super important.
Hannah, we've talked about what the sport needs. Now let's talk about what the athlete needs. What is one thing that you need as a women's action sports athlete to happen next? What needs to happen next for you?
Tell us the truth.
We're getting real.
I mean, for me, I think recently there's been a lot more companies getting behind individual female riders, which is super amazing. But I think that just needs to happen more. I think that there needs to be opportunity to make this a full-time job. A lot of people were worried about the progression of women's BMX for such a long time. But the truth was, whether they wanted to look at it or not, was as women or as BMX freestyle athletes, without the support of different companies, you're making whatever the prize money is, which is usually like okay money, but not something that you could live off of. And I know that a lot of women for a really long time had to have a job. And then, so working a full-time job and then trying to go and train and become one of the best in the world, it just didn't happen. And that's something that's been slowly getting fixed over the last probably 2 years, where we see a lot more companies getting involved in women, and a lot more people have been able to make that switch. But it also helps when, for me, it helped when Team USA got involved and all that.
By the way, congratulations punching your ticket to the Olympics last week.
Thank you. but for me, I mean, they got involved when I was like maybe 19 when they started paying me a salary, and that was kind of my point, whether I was going to have to get a job or not. I already moved out of my parents' house for some reason, and it was just like I had bills to pay, and BMX wasn't doing that. But you know, thankfully USA paid me, kept me in where I could do this full time, and that's why that's why my progression was able to take off in the way that it did. But for a lot of people, it's not like that, and they have to have a job. They have to have something that takes away from the time that they can spend on their bike or the time that they could spend in the gym. And I mean, that's the biggest thing as athletes. That's the biggest thing that we could ask for is just, you know, that opportunity that the men have and have had for decades. So.
I just have to add that I think I'm really excited about the X Games League because I think that will give you the opportunity to tap into more sponsorship and more consistent support. And I think that there should be more dollars and support for action sports in general. I mean, the first thing I thought when I went to the World Surf League was, why are these guys not paid as much as golfers? They're cooler.
Way cooler.
And they actually work really hard for brands and are entrepreneurial and influential in a way that maybe some other sports aren't. So I think we raise the game for all action sports and get the money over here.
Yeah.
Vicki, you have done such a good job of creating career longevity and visibility for yourself. And I think that's something that's hard because we all know in sports there is a shelf life, especially with action sports and a high risk injury field. How, very quickly, because we're running out of time here, unfortunately, we need a little bit more time, but how were you able to create longevity for yourself, and what advice would you have for others in the room looking to create long-standing relationships with the brands like you have?
I think first and foremost, I think we see, and I think Thayer touched on it a little bit, is one, we see a lot of great athletes, but that doesn't necessarily mean we see a lot of great humans. And that's been my goal from day one is just, I can be a great athlete, but I just want to be a great human and help everyone I can around me. And basically, I just want to have fun riding my dirt bike, and that ended up being a career. So I'm very lucky to be in the standing relationship with the brands that I've been with the same oil company since I was 7 years old. So a lot of brands are like family to me, and that's like the most important thing. I almost maybe do that too much to where maybe I should be a bit more business savvy, but I hold on to these brands like family, and that means a lot to me. But overall, I think just creating that longevity as to where Thayer touched on as well, it may not necessarily be the results that matter, which is very lucky for me because being in a male-dominated sport and the only female, I'm not getting the best results all the time, but I'm out there doing my best and trying. You know, I think at Red Bull Imagination, I think I got maybe second to last, but if you look at it as a big picture, I mean, shoot, there's probably not even a lot of men that want to go out there and even jump those jumps. So, you know, I try and look at it as a big picture, but as a competitor, I definitely get frustrated and fired up. But I'm very thankful to the brands and the people around me that support me for who I am and doing what I do instead of the results I get.
Being a good human, and that's something brands find value in. Thank you so much. Thayer, I'm going to allow you final thoughts.
Honored.
Where is the collective going, and is women's sports trending in the right direction?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so fun to be able to sit in this space. We're celebrating our 5-year anniversary this summer. We've been doing this work, like so many of all of us, for 2 decades. But 5 years ago, we were like, how do we actually take all of this and put a wrapper on it and a kind of a doorway and call it the collective and really sit in service of the entire industry? So 5 years later, it's really fun to be able to reflect on all the impact that we've made, the research that we've been able to put out, the communities that we've built, the business that we've been able to do, the tools that we've been able to create to help you know, brands and properties value themselves and athletes. And where we go from here is really how do we expand that geographically? So we are very much in the throes of the UK and Europe, and then we're branching out into Asia and the Middle East, which is really interesting and sticky just based on a lot of, I don't know, human rights. And then we're also looking at, how do we elevate the conversation around women through content in a way that isn't just docuseries and through social. So that's forthcoming, which we're excited about. But ultimately, women's sports is not having just a moment. It is hitting the front page. It's hitting, it's consistently talked about. It's consistently in the news. Women athletes continue to lead conversations, and women executives continue to lead conversations. So my feeling is it is the new economy of sports, candidly, and get in while the going's cheap, because it will only continue to rise. From what we see across the world, really. It's just everybody's investing, so get in now.
Thank you so much, Thayer. And that will conclude the Women's Forum here. I wish we had another few hours, because I just feel like this has been such an educational opportunity for all of us just to listen to these amazing women and see what we can do to benefit the sport and better it. Let's go ahead and give these ladies a big round of applause. And everyone who is here in attendance, we would encourage you to keep the conversation going. If you found something interesting, talk to other people who are here at the conference about it. Have those conversations, exchange phone numbers. This is a community. So thanks so much, ladies. That will conclude the Women's Forum and the first forum of the day. I think I see Brandon Graham out here somewhere. So I was told to toss the mic to you. You guys are up next. Hi. Hey, Brando. But thank you so much, ladies.